Chapter 1. The Stranding. The wind screamed off the Atlantic, a banshee wail that tore across the skeleton coast and raked its claws through the dunes. Lena Kohler stood ankle-deep in the sucking gray sand, her boots crunching against the shattered shells of 1,000 dead things. Before her loomed the Amsel, her research vessel, its steel belly split open on a jagged outcrop of rock like some gutted beast. The ocean gnashed at its hull, spitting foam and salt, as if furious it hadn't claimed the ship entirely. She pulled her scarf tighter against the cold, her breath fogging in sharp white bursts. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Lena was 35, wiry and weathered, with eyes that held the kind of stubborn glint you'd expect from someone who'd spent half her life chasing answers in places no one else dared to look. A marine biologist by trade, she'd come to this god-forsaken stretch of Namibia to study a die-off. Thousands of fish washing ashore, their bodies shriveled and wrong, crusted with salt like they'd been pickled in the desert sun. She'd seen mass strandings before, but nothing like this. The photos sent by the local rangers had haunted her. Silver scales turned to chalk, mouths gaping as if they'd screamed their last breath. She'd chartered the Amsel out of Lüderitz, loaded it with gear, and sailed north alone. No crew, no assistance, just her, the sea, and a gnawing need to understand. Now the ship was dead, and she was stranded. The storm had hit 2 nights ago, a freak squall that came out of nowhere, hurling the Amsel onto the rocks before she could drop anchor. She'd radioed for help, but the signal had cut out mid-sentence, leaving her with static and a voice she couldn't shake. A ranger's warning, half heard through the crackle. Stay off the dunes. Something's wrong here. She tried again this morning, but the radio was silent now, its guts fried by salt water or something worse. She was alone, 50 kilometers from the nearest outpost, with nothing but her pack, a tent, and the endless, bone-white shore. The sun hung low, a dull orange smear behind the haze, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers toward the dunes. Lena adjusted her gloves, cracked leather stained with years of brine, and crouched beside a pile of fish carcasses littering the beach. They were everywhere, a carpet of decay that stretched as far as she could see. She picked one up, a sardine, its body light as ash. It crumbled in her hand, leaving a gritty residue that stung her skin. The eyes were gone, hollowed out, replaced by tiny crystals that glinted like salt in the fading light. She frowned, brushing the dust off on her jeans. Dehydration, toxins, nothing natural did this. Not this fast, not this thoroughly. She stood, her knees creaking, and scanned the horizon. The skeleton coast earned its name. Shipwrecks dotted the shoreline, rusted hulks half buried in sand, their ribs jutting up like the skeletons of giants. Beyond the beach, the dunes rose sharp and steep, a wall of pale gold that swallowed the sky. The air smelled wrong, sharp and chemical, like bleach mixed with something rancid. She tilted her head, listening. The wind carried a sound beneath its howl, a low, wet rasp, faint but persistent, like a throat clearing over and over. It came from inland, from the dunes. Lena's hand drifted to the radio clipped to her belt, thumbing the button out of habit. Static hissed, then nothing. She cursed under her breath, her German accent thickening the word into a growl. She wasn't superstitious. Years at sea had beaten that out of her. But this place felt off, like the land itself was watching. She shook her head, shoving the thought down. She'd set up camp, salvage what she could from the Amsel, and figure out a plan. The fish were the priority. Answers didn't come from running. She trudged back to the ship, her boots sinking into the sand with each step. As she turned, her flashlight beam swept the dunes, catching a flicker, a shimmer like heat rising off pavement, there and gone. She froze, heart thudding. The rasp stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the crash of the sea. She took a step back, sand crunching underfoot, and muttered to herself, "Get it together, Cola." But her hand stayed on the flare gun, and her eyes lingered on the dunes, where the shadows waited. Chapter 2. The First Trace. The sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding a bruised purple across the sky as dusk settled over the skeleton coast. Lena Kohler knelt on the beach, her knees pressing into the damp, gritty sand, surrounded by the husks of dead fish. The air was colder now, sharp with salt and decay, and the wind had softened to a low moan, tugging at the edges of her scarf. She'd pitched her tent a dozen meters from the Amsel's wreck, its silhouette a dark scar against the fading light. But sleep was the last thing on her mind. The fish, or what was left of them, held her attention, their shriveled bodies scattered like offerings to some forgotten god. She adjusted the beam of her flashlight, its white glare cutting through the gloom. The sardine in her hand was a fragile thing, its scales flaking off at the slightest touch, revealing a dry, powdery flesh beneath. She turned it over, frowning as the beam caught the empty sockets where its eyes should have been. Tiny crystals glittered there, sharp and faceted, like grains of salt grown into something unnatural. She'd seen fish die-offs before, algal blooms, oxygen depletion, pollution. But this was different. The bodies weren't bloated or rotting. They were desiccated, drained, as if the sea itself had sucked them dry and spat them out. She set the fish down and pulled a sample vial from her pack, scooping the dust into it with a small metal spoon. Her hands were steady, but her pulse wasn't. The rasp came again, that wet, guttural sound she'd heard earlier, drifting from the dunes. It was louder now, closer, a rhythmic gurgle that made her stomach twist. She clicked off the flashlight and stood, ears straining. The wind carried it, threading it through the crash of the waves. A sound that didn't belong, like something alive and struggling to breathe. She turned toward the dunes, their pale crests glowing faintly under the rising moon. Nothing moved, but the shadows seemed to shift, pooling deeper in the hollows. She waited, breath held, until the rasp faded into silence. Her fingers tightened around the vial. Imagination, she told herself. Exhaustion, the storm, the wreck, the isolation, it was all gnawing at her edges. She turned back to the fish, sweeping the flashlight across the shore. That's when she saw it, a footprint pressed into the sand a few meters away. She froze, the beam trembling slightly as she traced its shape. It was human, or close to it, the arch of a heel and 5 toes clear enough. But the edges were wrong. Webbing stretched between the digits, faint ridges connecting them like the membrane of a frog's foot. The sand around it was wet, darker, as if something had dragged itself out of the sea. Her throat tightened. She stepped closer, crouching to examine it. The print was fresh, the edges crisp, not yet softened by the wind. It pointed inland, toward the dunes. Lena's mind raced. A survivor from another wreck. A local. The nearest settlement was miles away, and no one sane would wander this coast barefoot. She followed the trail with her light, spotting another print, then another, a staggered line, weaving toward the desert. The sand grew stickier underfoot, leaving a faint white crust on her boots. She stopped, wiping a finger across it, salt, gritty and damp, with that same bleach-like sting. Her nose wrinkled as she rubbed it off, the smell clawing at her sinuses. The rasp sounded again, sharp and sudden, so close it vibrated in her chest. She spun, flashlight slashing through the dark. The dunes loomed, silent and still, but something flickered at their edge. A shimmer, like a mirage, rippling the air. It was there for a heartbeat, a distortion against the sand, then gone. Her breath caught, a cold sweat prickling her neck. She swung the light back and forth, searching, but the night swallowed it whole. The rasp didn't return, leaving only the dull roar of the ocean and the thud of her own pulse. She forced herself to breathe, slow and deep, the way she'd learned during her first storm at sea. "You're tired," she muttered, her voice rough, swallowed by the wind. "That's all." But her hand slid to the flare gun at her hip, the weight of it a small comfort. She glanced at the footprints again, their webbed shapes stark in the sand. They didn't feel like a trick of the light. She grabbed her pack, slinging it over her shoulder, and started inland, following the trail. Answers didn't come from standing still. The beach gave way to the dunes, the sand rising in steep, shifting walls that blocked the sea's roar. The footprints grew fainter here, the wind scouring them into smudges, but they still pointed ahead, deeper into the desert. The air was drier, the salt smell fading into something earthier, older. Lena's boots sank with each step, the ground sucking at her like it resented her presence. She stopped, wiping sweat from her brow despite the chill, and aimed her flashlight forward. The beam caught the edge of a dune, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement. A low, scuttling shape, gone before she could focus. Her grip tightened on the flare gun. The sand shifted beneath her, a subtle ripple she felt more than saw. She stepped back, heart hammering, and shone the light at her feet. It was wet again, glistening, though the ocean was a distant murmur now. She knelt, touching it, cold, sticky, leaving a white film on her fingers. The rasp echoed once more, fainter but unmistakable, rolling out from the darkness ahead. Lena stood, her jaw set, and took another step into the dunes. Whatever was out there, she'd find it. She always did. Chapter 3. The Camp. The night pressed down on the skeleton coast, a heavy, starless shroud that swallowed the horizon. Lena Kohler sat cross-legged in her tent, a small dome of nylon staked into the sand, a stone's throw from the Amsel's wreck. The ocean's roar was a dull pulse through the fabric, mingling with the faint hum of her portable microscope, its battery pack glowing green in the dimness. She dragged her gear from the ship, sample vials, a laptop, a battered notebook, turning the tent into a makeshift lab. The air inside was stale, thick with the tang of salt and her own sweat, but it was better than the open beach, where the wind clawed and that rasp lingered like a ghost. She adjusted the microscope's lens, her cracked leather gloves discarded beside her, fingers raw from the day's work. On the slide was a pinch of the powdery residue from a dead sardine, magnified 100 times. The screen flickered as the image came into focus, and Lena's breath caught. The cells weren't just dead, they were crystallized, their membranes ruptured and filled with angular, salt-like structures that gleamed under the light. It was as if the fish had been invaded, their insides turned to mineral while they still swam. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes with the heels of her hands. "What the hell does this?" she muttered, her voice a rough whisper in the silence. Toxins could kill, sure, but this was transformation. Something she'd never seen in 15 years of staring down microscopes. She scribbled notes in her book, the pencil scratching against the page. Cellular crystallization. Salt intrusion? Unknown mechanism. Her handwriting was shaky, not from fear, not yet, but from the ache in her knuckles. They'd started cracking earlier, tiny fissures splitting the skin, though she hadn't touched anything rough enough to cause it. She flexed her fingers, wincing, and reached for her water bottle. It sat open on the tent floor, condensation beating on its rim. She took a swig, then froze. The taste hit her like a slap. Bitter, gritty, with a sting that burned her tongue. She spat it into the sand, coughing, and tipped the bottle upside down. A trickle of white sludge oozed out, clumping into grains that shimmered faintly. Salt. Not a trace of water left. Lena's stomach lurched. She'd filled it from the Amsel's tank that morning. Clean, filtered, safe. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it inside the bottle, the beam catching a thin crust lining the metal. Her pulse quickened. Contamination? Evaporation? Neither made sense. Not in hours. Not in this cold. She set the bottle down, her mind racing. And that's when she heard it again, the rasp, low and wet, circling the tent. It was closer now, a gurgling rhythm that seemed to seep through the nylon, brushing against her skin like damp breath. She clicked off the flashlight, plunging the tent into darkness, and held still, listening. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, tracing the perimeter. It wasn't the wind, she knew wind. Its hollow howl, its random gusts. This was alive, purposeful, a throat working through phlegm or water or something worse. She edged toward the tent flap, her hand sliding to the flare gun at her belt, its cold metal grounding her. The rasp paused, then swelled, a chorus of wet clicks that vibrated in her chest. She unzipped the flap an inch, peering out. The beach stretched empty under the moon's pale glow, the Amsel a hulking shadow to her left. The dunes rose beyond, their crests sharp and still, but the shadows between them seemed deeper, thicker, like ink pooling in a wound. Nothing moved. The rasp faded, leaving a ringing silence that pressed against her ears. Lena exhaled, her breath fogging in the chill, and zipped the flap shut. She sat back, dragging a hand through her short, tangled hair. "You're losing it, Kohler," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to her. She'd been alone too long. 3 weeks on the Amsel, no crew, no voices but her own. The wreck, the fish, the footprints. It was piling up, twisting her senses. She needed sleep, food, a clear head, but her eyes drifted to her hands, to the cracks on her knuckles, now red and weeping, a faint, clear fluid. She wiped it on her jeans, leaving a white streak. She turned back to the microscope, determined to focus. The sample was still there, its crystals glinting like tiny teeth. She adjusted the focus, zooming in further, and froze. Something moved, a faint twitch deep within the cell structure. A shimmer that wasn't light playing tricks. She blinked, leaning closer, but it was gone. Her heart thudded, a slow, heavy beat. She reached for her notebook again, but the rasp returned, sharp and sudden. Right outside the tent, the walls rippled as if something had brushed them, and the air grew heavy, thick with that bleach-like stink. Lena grabbed the flare gun and stood, her shadow looming against the nylon. She unzipped the flap fully this time, stepping out into the night. The beam of her flashlight swept the beach, sand, fish husks, the wreck, then the dunes. Nothing. The rasp stopped, but the silence felt wrong, alive, watching. She took a step, sand crunching under her boots, and noticed it was wet again, though the tide was still out. She shone the light at her feet, the grains glistening. sticky, leaving a faint crust on her soles. Her throat tightened. She swung the beam back to the dunes, and for a heartbeat, she saw it, a shimmer, rippling the air, low and fleeting, gone before she could breathe. She stood there, flare gun raised, the wind tugging at her scarf, until the cold drove her back inside. The tent felt smaller now, the walls closer, the hum of the microscope a frail shield against the dark. She sat, staring at the empty water bottle, the salt caked inside it like a warning. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just in the dunes. It was here, with her, and it was only beginning. Chapter 4. The Dunes. The morning sun clawed its way over the skeleton coast, a pale, watery light that did little to warm the air. Lena Kohler stood at the edge of the dunes, her pack slung over one shoulder, the flare gun holstered at her hip. The beach stretched behind her, a graveyard of fish husks and the Amsel's broken shell, but her eyes were fixed ahead, where the sand rose in steep golden waves. The webbed footprints she'd found last night trailed into that desert sea, faint now, scoured by the wind, but still visible. A jagged line beckoning her forward. She'd barely slept, the rasp echoing in her skull, the salt in her water bottle a splinter in her thoughts. Staying put wasn't an option. Answers lived out there, and she'd never been one to wait. She adjusted her scarf, the fabric stiff with dried sweat, and started walking. The sand shifted under her boots, soft and treacherous, sucking at her soles with each step. It was wetter here, though the ocean's roar had faded to a distant murmur, and the grains clung to her jeans, leaving white streaks that itched against her skin. She paused, crouching to touch it, cold, sticky, with that sharp, bleach-like bite she couldn't shake. Her knuckles, cracked and raw from the night before, stung as she wiped her hand clean. The air was drier inland, the salt smell thinning into something older, dustier, like the breath of a tomb. She straightened, her flashlight clipped to her belt, useless in the daylight but a comfort all the same. The footprints wove ahead, erratic and uneven, as if whatever made them had stumbled or dragged itself along. They were human-sized, the webbing between the toes, faint but unmistakable, pressed deep into the sand. Lena followed, her breath fogging in short bursts, her pulse a steady thud against her ribs. The dunes loomed taller now, their crests sharp against the sky, casting shadows that stretched like claws across her path. The wind was quieter here, a low hiss that barely stirred the grains, and the silence pressed in, thick and heavy. She glanced back once. The beach was a thin gray line, the Amsel a speck. No turning back now. The trail led her to a shallow dip between two dunes, a bowl of sand ringed by steep slopes. She stopped, her boots sinking deeper, and swept her eyes over the ground. The footprints ended abruptly, smudged into a chaotic patch, as if something had thrashed or fallen. In the center stood a rusted whaling harpoon, its shaft half buried, its barbed tip jutting up like a broken tooth. The metal was pitted, crusted with age, but the point gleamed faintly, stained black with something that wasn't rust. Lena's stomach tightened. She stepped closer, the sand sucking at her legs, and knelt beside it. The harpoon was old, decades, maybe centuries, but the stain looked fresh, wet, glistening in the sun. She reached out, hesitating, then pulled her hand back. No samples without gloves, not yet. The rasp came then, sharp and sudden. A wet gurgle that rolled down the dunes like a wave. Lena shot to her feet, spinning, her hand flying to the flare gun. The sound was everywhere, a chorus of clogged throats, vibrating the air, rattling her bones. She scanned the crests above, nothing but sand and sky, the shadows still and empty. The rasp swelled, clicking and bubbling, closer now, as if it were rising from the ground itself. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. She unholstered the flare gun, its weight cold in her palm, and aimed it at the nearest dune. "Show yourself," she growled, her voice swallowed by the vastness. A shadow moved, low, scuttling, a blur against the sand. She jerked the gun toward it, heart slamming, but it was gone before she could track it, vanishing over the crest. The rasp cut off, leaving a ringing silence that buzzed in her ears. She stood frozen, the harpoon at her feet, the dunes watching. Her compass, clipped to her pack, spun wildly when she checked it, the needle twitching like a trapped insect. She cursed under her breath, shoving it back into her pocket. The air grew heavier, the bleach stink sharpening, stinging her eyes. She blinked hard, wiping her face, and that's when she saw it. A burn on her wrist, 3 parallel lines, red and raw, like claw marks. She hadn't felt it happen. Lena stared, her mind racing. She hadn't brushed anything sharp, hadn't fallen. The lines throbbed, faint but insistent, and when she touched them, her fingers came away damp. Not blood, but a clear, salty fluid that left a white film. Her throat closed. She yanked her sleeve down, hiding it, and forced herself to breathe. "Focus," she muttered, turning back to the harpoon. She'd mark its location, come back with proper tools. But the sand shifted again, a subtle ripple underfoot, and she stumbled, catching herself on one knee. It was wetter now, glistening, pooling around her boots like a tide she couldn't see. She stood, the flare gun still in hand, and followed the footprint's last smudge up the dune slope. The sand dragged at her, heavier with each step, coating her legs in a crust that cracked and reformed. At the crest, she stopped, gazing out. The dunes stretched endless, a golden labyrinth under a sky turning gray. The rasp echoed again, fainter but deeper, a growl from beneath the earth. She tightened her grip on the gun, her burn pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Whatever had left those prints, whatever had driven that harpoon into the sand, it was out there, and it knew she was here. Chapter 5. The Sinkhole. The day bled into a gray, oppressive haze, the sun a faint smear behind clouds that hung low over the skeleton coast. Lena Kohler trudged through the dunes, her boots sinking into the shifting sand, her pack a dead weight against her spine. The webbed footprints had faded hours ago, scoured away by the wind, but she pressed on, driven by the rusted harpoon's black-stained tip and the burn on her wrist. 3 red lines that throbbed like a warning she couldn't ignore. The air was thick, heavy with that bleach-like sting, and the sand clung to her legs, wet and gritty, leaving white crusts that cracked with each step. She'd stopped wiping it off. It was everywhere now, a second skin she couldn't shed. The dunes stretched endless, their crests sharp and silent, but the quiet was wrong, too still, too alive. The rasp had followed her all morning, a wet, gurgling echo that darted between the slopes, never close enough to pinpoint, never far enough to dismiss. It was in her head now, a rhythm that matched her pulse, and she hated it. Hated how it made her flinch, how it turned every shadow into a threat. She gripped the flare gun tighter, its metal warm from her hand, and kept moving. The harpoon meant something. Someone had been here, fought here. She'd find out why. The trail, or what was left of it, led her to a valley between 2 towering dunes, a shallow bowl where the sand lay smooth and undisturbed. She stopped, catching her breath, and scanned the ground. No footprints, no harpoon, just an expanse of pale gold that shimmered faintly, wetter than it should be. Her boots sank deeper here, the sand sucking at her like a living thing, and she felt it, a ripple, subtle but real, trembling up her legs. She stepped back, heart thudding, and that's when she saw it, a sinkhole, 10 feet wide, its edges jagged and crusted with salt crystals that glinted like broken glass. It yawned in the center of the valley, a black maw that exhaled a rancid stench, brine and rot, sharp enough to make her eyes water. Lena crouched at the edge, her flashlight unclipped from her belt, its beam slicing into the dark. The hole dropped straight down, its walls slick and glistening, disappearing beyond the light's reach. She pulled a flare from her pack, struck it against the striker, and dropped it. The red glow hissed as it fell, spinning, illuminating nothing but endless shadow. It didn't hit bottom. 10 seconds, 20, then gone, swallowed whole. Her stomach twisted. How deep was this thing? She leaned closer, the sand crumbling under her knees, and shone the flashlight again. The walls caught the light, wet and veined with thin, pulsing growths, pale, thread-like, moving faintly as if stirred by a breeze she couldn't feel. The rasp swelled, sudden and loud, a chorus of wet throats rising from the pit. Lena jolted back, scrambling to her feet. The flare gun raised. The sound rolled over her, vibrating in her chest, her teeth, her skull. A gurgle that wasn't just sound but pressure, pushing against her skin. She swung the flashlight wildly, the beam slashing across the dunes, but they stood empty, their shadows long and still. The rasp faded, leaving a silence that buzzed, thick with menace. Her breath came in sharp gasps, fogging the air, and she noticed the burn on her wrist glowing faintly, a pale blue shimmer under her sleeve. She yanked it down, hiding it, but the throb deepened, sinking with the pit's unseen pulse. She forced herself to focus, kneeling again, her hands trembling as she pulled a rope from her pack. She tied it to a rock, half buried, solid enough, and tested the knot. The sinkhole stared back, its stench coiling up like a dare. She had to know. The fish, the footprints, the harpoon, it all led here, to this hole in the earth. She clipped the flashlight to her chest, its beam angled down, and gripped the rope, lowering herself over the edge. The sand gave way in clumps, pattering into the dark, and the walls closed in, slick and cold, against her shoulders. The descent was slow, her boots slipping on the wet surface, the rope biting into her palms. The air grew heavier, damp and sour, clinging to her lungs. At 10 feet, the walls glistened brighter, the vein-like growths thicker, pulsing faster. She reached out, brushing one with her glove, soft, warm like flesh under a thin membrane. It twitched, and she snatched her hand back, bile rising in her throat. The flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering, and the rasp returned. Softer now, a whisper from below. She froze, dangling, the rope creaking under her weight. The burn on her wrist flared, hot and sharp, and she gritted her teeth, pushing it out of her mind. At 20 feet, the walls widened, the pit opening into a void she couldn't see. The rope swayed, the rock above holding firm, but the sand rippled again. A tremor she felt through the line. She glanced up. The valley's edge was a faint circle of gray, shrinking as she descended. The stench was unbearable now, a mix of salt and decay that coated her tongue. She swung the flashlight down, searching, and caught a glint. Something white, jagged, embedded in the wall. Bones. She steadied herself, leaning closer. Not just bones, teeth, curved and yellowed, fused into the salt like they'd grown there. Her chest tightened. This wasn't natural. None of it was. The rasp surged, a guttural roar that shook the pit, and the walls pulsed, the growths writhing like worms. Lena's grip slipped, the rope burning her hands as she slid a foot, then caught herself, gasping. The flashlight swung, its beam dancing, and she saw it. A shadow, low and fluid, scuttling across the wall below. It was gone in an instant, but the rasp lingered, circling, calling. She hung there, sweat stinging her eyes, the burn on her wrist, a fire under her skin. She couldn't go back, not yet, but the pit knew she was here, and it was waiting. Chapter 6. The Tunnel. The rope creaked as Lena Kohler hung suspended in the sinkhole. her boots dangling over an abyss that swallowed her flashlight's beam. The air was a thick, wet shroud, sour with brine and rot, pressing against her lungs like a hand. She descended past the pulsing, vein-like growths, past the glint of teeth fused into the salt-crusted walls, and now the pit widened below her, a black void that hummed with the faint, wet rasp she'd come to dread. Her wrist burned, the 3 claw-like marks glowing a sickly blue under her sleeve, throbbing in time with the unseen pulse of this place. She gripped the rope tighter, her palms raw and slick with sweat, and lowered herself further, the rock above a distant anchor in the gray light. At 30 feet, her boots brushed something solid, a ledge narrow and slick, jutting from the wall. She swung onto it, her knees buckling as she found her footing, the rope still taut in her hands. The ledge was barely 2 feet wide, its surface glistening with moisture, and it sloped downward into a tunnel that yawned ahead, a jagged mouth carved into the salt. The flashlight clipped to her chest flickered, its beam stuttering across the opening, revealing walls that shimmered like wet flesh, pale, veined, pulsing faintly as if alive. The stench hit her harder here, a cloying mix of decay and ammonia that coated her throat. She gagged, pulling her scarf over her nose, but it did little to help. The rasp echoed from the tunnel, soft now, a gurgling whisper that curled around her like smoke. She unholstered the flare gun, its weight a frail shield, and took a step forward, the ledge crumbling slightly under her boots. The sand was gone, replaced by a slick organic film that sucked at her soles, leaving white threads trailing behind her. She aimed the flashlight down the tunnel, its beam cutting through the dark, and froze. The burn flared hot and sharp, and she clenched her teeth, pushing it down. Focus. She had to focus. The tunnel bent sharply, the walls slicker, the bones piled higher, whales, sharks, things she couldn't name, their shapes warped, fused into the salt like they'd melted together. A voice whispered her name, dry and cracked, from deeper in. Lena! A sound that wasn't human, wasn't anything she knew. She swung the flashlight toward it, the beam trembling, but the tunnel stretched empty, its end lost in shadow. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath fogging in the damp air. "Who's there?" she barked, her voice echoing, swallowed by the rasp. No answer, just that whisper again, fainter, mocking. She took another step, and the flashlight flickered out, plunging her into blackness. She cursed, slapping it against her palm, but it was dead. Battery, bulb, something gone. The dark was absolute, pressing against her eyes, and the rasp surged, loud and close, a wet roar that shook the tunnel. She stumbled back, flare gun raised, and something brushed her face, cold, clammy, grainy, like a hand made of salt and slime. She screamed, swinging blindly, the gun clattering to the ground as she hit the wall. The thing was gone, but her cheek burned where it touched, a gritty sting that spread like fire. The flashlight sputtered back on, weak and flickering, casting jagged shadows across the bones. Lena grabbed the flare gun, her hands shaking, and aimed it down the tunnel. Nothing moved, but the walls pulsed harder, the veins writhing like worms under skin. Her cheek throbbed, and she touched it. Her fingers came away white, coated in salt that crumbled from her skin. The burn on her wrist glowed brighter, blue light seeping through her sleeve, and she felt it. Something inside her, shifting, waking. The rasp softened, a lullaby now calling her deeper. She stood there, chest heaving, the tunnel stretching ahead like a throat. The bones at her feet weren't just remains, they were warnings, pieces of what came before. Her scarf slipped, and she didn't bother fixing it, the stench a part of her now. She wiped her face, salt flaking off, and tightened her grip on the flare gun. She couldn't stop, not here, not now. Whatever had touched her, whatever whispered her name, it was down there, and she'd face it. She took a step, the tunnel swallowing her shadow. The Raspa hymn in her ears. Chapter 7. The Nest. The tunnel stretched on, a suffocating vein beneath the skeleton coast, and Lena Kohler pressed deeper, her boots slipping on the slick, bone-strewn floor. The walls pulsed around her, warm and wet, their vein-like growths writhing in the flickering beam of her chest-clipped flashlight. The air was a miasma of rot and brine, so thick it clung to her lungs, her throat, her skin. The rasp was constant now, a wet, gurgling hymn that vibrated through the salt-crusted passage, threading itself into her heartbeat, her breath. Her wrist burned, the 3 claw-like marks glowing blue through her sleeve, and her cheeks stung where something cold and grainy had brushed her. A touch she couldn't unfeel, a mark that flaked salt when she scratched it. She gripped the flare gun, its metal slick with her sweat, and moved forward, driven by a need she couldn't name. The tunnel widened, the ceiling arching higher, and the bones grew denser, piles of them, fused into the walls, the floor, a graveyard of warped shapes. Whales, seals, humans, their skeletons twisted together, salt crystals blooming from their cracks like fungi. Lena's flashlight stuttered, its light weak and yellow, casting jagged shadows that danced with the pulse of the walls. The rasp swelled, a chorus of clogged throats, and the ground sloped downward, slicker now, coated in a film that sucked at her boots, leaving white tendrils trailing behind. She steadied herself, one hand brushing the wall, soft, too soft, like flesh under a thin skin, and yanked it back, bile rising in her throat. The tunnel bent, then opened, and she stopped, her breath catching in a ragged gasp. Before her sprawled a cavern, vast and dark, its walls glistening with the same wet, pulsing sheen. The floor dipped into a shallow basin, and at its center lay a pool of black water, still and oily, bubbling faintly as if something breathed beneath. Around it rose mounds of salt-crusted husks. Animals, people, their bodies shriveled and hollowed, their limbs bent at impossible angles. Fish with crystallized eyes, seals with gaping maws, a human torso with no head, its ribs splayed like a flower, all drained dry, their flesh crumbling to dust at the edges. The stench was unbearable. A wall of decay that hit her like a fist, and she gagged, pulling her scarf over her mouth, her eyes watering. The rasp came from the pool, a deep, wet gurgle that rolled through the cavern, shaking the mounds, sending salt flaking to the ground. Lena took a step, her boots crunching on a bird's skull, and aimed the flashlight at the water. The beam caught a ripple, slow and deliberate, and then a shape. Too large, too fluid, sliding beneath the surface. It was gone in an instant, but the water trembled, bubbles bursting with a hiss that carried her name, Lena. In that cracked, dry whisper she'd heard before, her heart slammed against her ribs, her wrist burning hotter, the blue glow seeping through her jacket now, lighting her path. She edged closer, the flare gun raised, her flashlight flickering wildly. The mounds loomed around her, their husks staring with empty sockets, and she saw it. Movement, faint but real, in the pile to her left. A seal's corpse twitched, its flipper curling, then fell still. She swung the light toward it, breath shallow, and noticed the salt on its body shifting, grains sliding upward like ants. The rasp surged, a roar now, and the flashlight died, plunging her into darkness. She slapped it, cursed, but it was gone, leaving only the blue glow from her wrist, a frail, ghostly light that painted the cavern in shadows. Something brushed her leg, cold, grainy, a tendril that slithered across her calf and tightened. The walls pulsed faster, the bones crunching underfoot, and a tendril lashed out, grazing her ankle, cold and sharp. She yanked free, pain searing her leg, and kept running, the cavern's roar chasing her, her name echoing in its depths. She reached the ledge, gasping, and grabbed the rope, hauling herself up. The blue glow from her wrist lit the sinkhole's walls, the veins wriggling like worms, and the rasp followed, fainter but relentless. Her ankle throbbed, salt flaking from her jeans where the tendril had touched, and her cheek burned hotter, gritty under her fingers. She climbed, the rope biting her palms, until the gray circle of daylight grew above her. She collapsed at the sinkhole's edge, chest heaving, the dunes silent around her. The flare's light died below, and the rasp softened, a whisper now, waiting. Lena lay there, staring at the sky, her pack abandoned in the tunnel, her body trembling. The pool, the husks, the thing beneath, it wasn't just alive. It was feeding, growing, and it had seen her. She touched her wrist, the burn pulsing, and knew she couldn't leave it behind. Not anymore. Chapter 8. The Truth. The dawn broke over the skeleton coast in a thin, cold line, a gray smear that barely pierced the haze cloaking the dunes. Lena Kohler lay sprawled at the sinkhole's edge, her chest heaving, her body a map of aches and burns. The rope dangled into the pit behind her, its end frayed where she'd clawed her way up, and the rasp lingered in her ears, a faint, wet whisper that clung like damp rot. Her wrist glowed blue, the 3 claw-like marks pulsing beneath her torn sleeve, and her ankle throbbed where the tendril had grazed her, salt flaking from her jeans in gritty clumps. Her cheek stung, a gritty patch spreading where that cold, clammy thing had brushed her in the tunnel. She was alive, but she didn't feel it, not yet. The dunes stretched silent around her, their crests sharp and still, the air heavy with that bleach-like bite. She rolled onto her side, coughing, and spat into the sand, a white, grainy fleck that shimmered faintly. Her throat burned, her tongue coated with a taste she couldn't rinse away. Her pack was gone, left in the tunnel with her microscope, her notes, her sanity, but she'd kept the flare gun, its barrel cool against her hip, and a small satchel she'd grabbed in her flight. She fumbled it open, hands trembling, and pulled out a leather-bound journal, cracked, water-stained, found wedged in the Amsel's hold days ago. She hadn't read it then, too focused on the fish, the wreck. Now it felt like a lifeline. She sat up, wincing as her ankle protested, and opened the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible, written in a tight slanted scrawl. German, dated 1873. A whaler's log from a ship called the Eisvogel. She skimmed the early entries, hunts, storms, the crew's grumbling, until the words sharpened into something darker. The locals warned us off the coast. The captain wrote, called it cursed, said the salt beneath takes more than fish. We laughed, fools. Lena's pulse quickened. She flipped ahead, the handwriting growing erratic. 3 men lost in the dunes. Found them days later, husks, salt in their veins. The crew mutinies, says we woke it. Sank the ship to trap it, but it's still here. The last page was a scrawl. It knows us now. God help us. Lena closed the journal, her hands cold despite the burn on her wrist. The Eisvogel, one of the wrecks dotting the coast, its ribs jutting from the sand like a warning she'd ignored. The whalers had seen it too. The husks, the salt, the thing beneath. They'd fed it, fought it, and lost. She touched her ankle, the skin red and cracked where the tendril had touched, and felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The fish, the footprints, the cavern. It wasn't random. It was old, older than the whalers, and it was awake again. The rasp sounded, faint but close, a gurgle rolling from the sinkhole. Lena scrambled to her feet, flare gun in hand, and backed away, the sand sucking at her boots. The dunes shimmered, wet and sticky, and she saw it. A ripple, subtle but real, spreading outward from the pit. Her cheek burned hotter, salt flaking under her nails as she scratched it, and her eyes caught a reflection in a puddle nearby. They were clouding, a faint white haze creeping into the edges, like the fish she'd studied. She blinked hard, panic clawing at her chest, and the reflection cleared, or she told herself it did. She turned toward the beach, the Amsel a distant speck against the gray sea. She had to get back, salvage what she could, find a signal, anything. But the sand shifted again, a tremor that knocked her to her knees, and the rasp swelled, a chorus now, wet and hungry. She crawled, flare gun clutched tight, her wrist glowing brighter, the blue light casting shadows that danced like tendrils. The journal slipped from her grasp, pages fluttering open, and she grabbed it, stuffing it into her jacket. The whaler's words burned in her mind. It knows us now. It knew her, too, had touched her, marked her. The dunes loomed, their shadows lengthening as the haze thickened, and the rasp followed, circling, calling. Lena staggered upright, her ankle screaming, and limped toward the coast. The sand clung to her, wetter now, leaving white streaks that hardened on her legs, cracking with each step. Her breath fogged, sharp and white, and she felt it. A weight inside her, shifting, growing. The burn on her wrist pulsed, the blue glow seeping into her veins, and her cheek flaked more salt, a gritty trail down her neck. She didn't look back at the sinkhole, didn't need to. It was with her now, in her, and the truth was a knife in her gut. She wasn't just a witness. She was part of it. Chapter 9. The Return. The dunes of the skeleton coast loomed like silent sentinels under a sky choked with gray haze, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the sand. Lena Kohler stumbled forward, her legs trembling, her breath a ragged wheeze that fogged in the cold air. The sinkhole lay behind her, a black wound in the earth, its rasp a wet whisper that clung to her heels, relentless and hungry. Her wrist burned, the 3 claw-like marks glowing blue through her torn sleeve, pulsing with a rhythm she felt in her bones. Her ankle throbbed where the tendril had grazed her, salt crusting the skin, and her cheek flaked more grit with each step, a spreading stain she couldn't wipe away. The whaler's journal was stuffed inside her jacket, its weight a grim anchor, but her flare gun was all she gripped now, its barrel slick with sweat and sand. She had to reach the Amsel, the beach, something, anything to escape the dunes, the pit, the thing that knew her name. The sand sucked at her boots, wet and sticky, dragging her down with every stride. It was alive, she knew it now, shifting underfoot, rippling like a tide she couldn't see. She'd felt it since the cavern, the tendrils, the husks, the eyeless mass beneath the pool, and the journal had confirmed it. The salt beneath wasn't just a place. It was a force, a hunger, and it had marked her. Her eyes stung, a faint white haze clouding the edges of her vision, and she blinked hard, refusing to look at her reflection again. Not yet. The rasp swelled, a gurgling roar that rolled from the dunes, vibrating the air, her skull. She broke into a run, her ankles screaming, the sand pulling harder, clawing at her legs. White crusts hardened on her jeans, cracking and reforming, and she felt it. Grains sliding up her skin, under her clothes, a gritty itch she couldn't scratch. The dunes shimmered wet and gold, and the bleach stink sharpened, burning her lungs. She crested a slope, the beach a gray smear in the distance, the Amsel's wreck, a faint promise of safety. Her chest heaved, her breath fogging white, and she whispered to herself, "Just get there. Just get there." The sand shifted, a violent tremor that threw her to her knees. She hit hard, the flare gun skidding from her hand, and the ground buckled, dragging her back toward the sinkhole. She clawed at it, nails scraping, but it was like fighting water, wet, relentless, alive. The rasp turned shrill, a chorus of wet throats, and she saw them, figures rising from the dunes, staggering toward her. They were husks, hollowed-out shells of men, their skin shriveled and salt-crusted, their mouths gaping in silent screams. Whalers, she knew, the Icevogel's crew, their eyes gone, their hands reaching. One lurched closer, its fingers bent and black, and she smelled it, rot and brine, a stench that matched the cavern. Lena scrambled for the flare gun, her fingers closing around it as the sand pulled harder, a sucking tide that yanked her boots deep. She fired, the red streak arcing into the nearest husk, bursting into flame. It shrieked, a dry, cracked wail, and collapsed, salt pouring from its chest. But the others kept coming, their steps slow, deliberate. The ground trembled again, and she felt it, a tendril, cold and grainy, brushing her calf, wrapping tight. She kicked free, pain searing her leg, and crawled forward. The beach so close now, the waves a dull roar in her ears. Her wrist glowed brighter, the blue light seeping into her veins, and her cheek burned hotter, salt flaking down her neck, into her collar. She glanced back. The husks staggered, their shadows merging with the dunes, and the sand rippled, a wave that chased her. The Amsel loomed ahead, its hull cracked and tilted, a relic of her old life. She reached the beach, collapsing onto the fish-strewn shore, her hands sinking into the damp, gray mess. The sand here was wet too, sticky, leaving white streaks on her palms. But it held, barely. The rasp followed, circling, and the husks stopped at the dune's edge. Their eyeless faces turned toward her. They didn't move, didn't chase, just watched, their mouths twitching in unison with the gurgle. Lena staggered to her feet, her ankle buckling, and limped toward the wreck. The tide was out, the waves a distant crash, but the sand shimmered, wet and wrong, and she felt it again. Grains sliding under her skin, up her arms, a weight in her chest. Her eyes clouded more, the haze thickening, and she pressed a hand to her face, salt crumbling from her lashes. She reached the Amsel, leaning against its rusted hull, her breath a sob. The husks stood silent, the dunes rippling behind them, and the rasp softened, a lullaby now calling her back. Her wrist pulsed, the blue glow spreading, and she knew. They weren't chasing her because they didn't need to. She was theirs already, marked, claimed. The journal's words echoed. It knows us now. And she sank to her knees, the flare gun slipping from her hand, the sand sucking at her like a lover's embrace. Chapter 10, The Feeding. The Skeleton Coast's beach was a gray, desolate sprawl, its sand wet and treacherous under Lena Kohler's boots as she staggered from the Amsel's wreck. The husks of the whalers loomed at the dune's edge, eyeless and still, their salt-crusted forms a silent jury watching her collapse. Her ankle screamed, her wrist burned with a blue glow that seeped through her torn sleeve, and her cheek flaked salt in gritty trails down her neck. The rasp was everywhere now, a wet, gurgling hymn that pulsed in her skull, her chest, her veins. She'd tried to run, to reach the ship, to escape, but the sand had other plans. It shifted beneath her, a living tide that sucked her down, dragging her back toward the dunes, the sinkhole, the cavern she'd fled. She clawed at it, nails scraping, the flare gun lost somewhere in the mess of fish husks and salt. The ground buckled, a violent tremor that threw her flat, and the sand surged, pulling her like a riptide. She screamed, her voice raw, swallowed by the rasp, and the husks moved, slow, deliberate, their hands reaching as the dunes rippled behind them. The sand tightened around her legs, her waist, a cold, grainy grip that crushed the air from her lungs. Her wrist glowed brighter, the blue light pulsing in time with the earth, and her eyes clouded. a white haze thickening until the beach blurred into a smear of gray and gold. The husks closed in, their mouths gaping, and the sand swallowed her whole. Darkness took her, a suffocating plunge, and then she was falling, tumbling through the sinkhole's throat, the walls slick and pulsing, the rasp a roar that shook her bones. She hit the cavern floor hard, her body slamming into the slick organic film, bones crunching beneath her. Whales, seals, humans fused into the salt. Pain seared her ankle, her ribs, but she couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. The air too thick, too sour with rot and brine. The pool loomed ahead, black and oily, bubbling with a rhythm she felt inside her, and the husks followed, dragging her toward it, their hands cold and grainy on her arms, her legs. Lena thrashed, kicking free, but the sand shifted again, pulling her closer, a tide she couldn't fight. The pool erupted, tendrils rising, dozens, hundreds, salt-encrusted and writhing, glistening with a gritty sheen. They lashed out, wrapping her wrists, her ankles, her throat, cold and sharp, cutting into her skin. She gasped, salt flooding her mouth, her lungs, and the blue glow from her wrist spread, lighting the cavern in a sickly haze. The tendrils didn't kill her. They held her, lifted her, dragging her over the pool's edge until she hung suspended, staring into its depths. The water parted, and it rose, a mass of writhing limbs and tendrils, eyeless, endless, a grotesque tangle of salt and flesh that pulsed with the cavern's heartbeat. It had no face, no form, just a hunger that radiated through the air, the ground, her body. The tendrils tightened, piercing her skin, and she felt it, something flowing out of her, not blood, but memories, fear, pieces of herself. Her childhood flashed, cold German winters, her father's stern voice, then dissolved, crumbling to salt in her mind. She screamed, the sound wet and choked, and the entity fed, siphoning her life through the tendrils, her veins, her burns. Her wrist burned white hot, the blue glow fading as the salt spread, hardening her skin, cracking her joints. She saw her sister's face, Anna laughing by the sea, then gone, drained dry, a husk in her thoughts. The husks around her knelt, their eyeless sockets turned upward worshiping, and she understood. They weren't guards, they were offerings, bound to this thing, feeding it through centuries. The tendrils burrowed deeper, cold and grainy, and her body stiffened, her fingers curling into claws, salt flaking from her nails. Her eyes clouded fully, a white film that blinded her, but she felt it still, the entity inside her, tasting her guilt, her stubbornness, her need to know. She hung there, half alive, half salt, her mind fraying as it took more. Her first dive, the Amsel's deck, the fish she'd studied, all crumbling, all feeding the mass. The rasp was her voice now, a wet gurgle that echoed from her throat, and she saw herself in the pool's surface, a reflection, shriveled and hollow, her mouth gaping, her eyes gone. The tendrils pulsed, draining faster, and her legs cracked, salt blooming from the wounds, hardening her flesh. She was dissolving, becoming one of them, a husk to kneel and worship. But something flickered, a shard of will, a memory it hadn't touched. Her mother's hands, warm, braiding her hair. Lena clung to it, a lifeline, and her body twitched, fighting the tendrils' grip. The entity roared, a sound that shook the cavern, the walls pulsing faster, and the husks rose, reaching for her again. She was theirs, it said, marked from the start. But she wasn't done. Not yet. The salt spread, her skin flaking, her breath a dry rasp, but she held that memory, a spark in the dark, and waited for the end. Chapter 11, The Fight. The cavern beneath the skeleton coast pulsed with a sick, wet rhythm, its walls glistening like flesh in the dim blue glow spilling from Lena Kohler's wrist. She hung suspended above the black pool, tendrils of salt and slime coiled around her arms, her legs, her throat, their cold, grainy tips burrowing into her skin. The entity loomed below, a writhing, eyeless mass of limbs and hunger, feeding on her, draining her memories, her fear, herself. Her body cracked, salt blooming from her wounds, hardening her flesh, and her eyes were a clouded white haze, blinding her to all but the rasp. Her rasp now, a wet gurgle that echoed from her chest. The husks knelt around the pool, their shriveled forms trembling, worshipping the thing that claimed her. But Lena clung to a shard of herself, a memory of her mother's hands, warm and steady, braiding her hair on a winter morning. It was small, fragile, but it burned in her mind. A spark the entity hadn't touched. She seized it, her body twitching against the tendril's grip, and the mass roared, a guttural bellow that shook the cavern, rattling the bones fused into the walls. The tendrils tightened, piercing deeper, and salt flared from her skin, her fingers curling into claws, her legs stiffening into brittle husks. She was dissolving, becoming one of them, but that spark held, defiant, alive, and she fought. Her right arm jerked free, the tendril snapping with a wet crack, salt spraying across the pool. Pain seared her shoulder, her wrist glowing white-hot, but she reached down, fumbling at her belt. The whaler's harpoon, small, rusted, tucked into her satchel since the dunes, scraped against her hip, its barbed tip still stained black. She grabbed it, her hand trembling, salt flaking from her knuckles, and drove it into the nearest tendril. The entity shrieked, a sound that clawed at her skull, and the tendril recoiled, black ooze dripping from the wound. The pool bubbled furiously, waves crashing against the husks, and the rasp turned shrill, a chorus of rage. Lena swung again, the harpoon slashing through another tendril, her arm heavy, her joints cracking with each move. The salt spread faster, her skin splitting, but she gritted her teeth, the memory of her mother's hands a lifeline in her mind. "Not yours," she rasped, her voice dry and broken, barely her own. The husks rose, staggering toward her, their hands reaching, but she kicked, her boot crunching into a skull, salt pouring from its shattered face. The tendrils lashed back, wrapping her legs tighter, pulling her down, and she stabbed again, the harpoon sinking into the pool's edge, black water hissing around it. The entity surged, tendrils erupting in a frenzy, and the cavern shook, chunks of salt crashing from the ceiling. Lena's left arm snapped free, the tendril tearing away, and she gripped the harpoon with both hands, driving it deeper. The mass thrashed, its limbs flailing, and she felt it, a faltering, a flicker in its hunger. The tendrils loosened just enough, and she dropped, hitting the cavern floor hard, her knees buckling under the salt-crusted weight of her legs. She crawled, dragging herself toward the tunnel. The harpoon clutched tight, its tip dripping black. The husks lunged, their fingers grazing her back, cold and grainy. But she swung the harpoon, slashing through a rib cage, salt exploding in a cloud. The pool roared behind her, tendrils rising higher, and the entity's voice boomed. Not a whisper now, but a command. Mine. It was in her head, her chest, her veins, and her wrist pulsed, the blue glow fading as salt hardened her skin, her breath a dry wheeze. She stabbed the harpoon into the ground, using it to pull herself up, and staggered toward the tunnel's mouth, the walls pulsing faster, closing in. The tendrils chased her, lashing the air, and one caught her ankle, yanking her back. She screamed, twisting, and drove the harpoon down, pinning the tendril to the floor. It writhed, black ooze pooling, and she tore free, her ankle splitting, salt flaking in chunks. The pool erupted, a wave of black water crashing over the husks, and the entity roared again, the cavern trembling, bones raining down. Lena reached the tunnel, collapsing against the wall, its warm, wet surface sucking at her hands. She stabbed the harpoon into the pool one last time, the flare of pain blinding and the water stilled, the tendrils sinking, the rasp fading to a whisper. She crawled, her body breaking, salt cracking her elbows, her knees, her breath a dry rattle. The blue glow dimmed, her wrist cold now, and her eyes cleared, the haze lifting just enough to see the tunnel stretch ahead. The husks didn't follow, their forms slumping, and the cavern grew quiet, the pulse slowing, the entity retreating, but not gone. She felt it still, inside her, a weight in her chest, a hunger that waited. The harpoon clattered from her hand, her fingers too stiff to hold it, and she dragged herself forward, the memory of her mother's hands flickering, fading, but enough, barely enough, to keep her moving. Chapter 12. The Endless Shore. The tunnel beneath the skeleton coast was a collapsing vein, its walls pulsing faintly as Lena Kohler dragged herself upward, her body a ruin of salt and flesh. The rasp had faded to a whisper, a wet gurgle that lingered in her ears, her chest. But the cavern's roar was gone, the entity stilled, for now, by the whaler's harpoon she'd left buried in its pool. Her hands cracked with each pull, salt flaking from her knuckles, her elbows, her skin splitting into brittle shards. Her legs trailed behind, half-hardened, dragging through the slick, bone-strewn film. And her breath was a dry rattle, a shadow of the woman who'd descended hours ago. The blue glow on her wrist had dimmed, cold and faint, but the burn remained, a scar she couldn't shed. The air grew lighter, less sour, as she neared the sinkhole's ledge, the rope still dangling from her climb. She gripped it, her fingers stiff, salt crumbling from her nails, and hauled herself up inch by agonizing inch. The walls pressed close, their vein-like growths twitching faintly, brushing her shoulders with a clammy touch she barely felt. Her ankles split wider, salt pouring from the wound where the tendril had torn her, and her cheek flaked more grit, a trail down her neck into her collar. She didn't stop, couldn't stop, the memory of her mother's hands, braiding her hair, a fading ember that pushed her forward when her body begged to quit. The gray circle of daylight grew above, a cold promise, and Lena reached the sinkhole's edge, collapsing onto the sand. Her chest heaved, her breath fogging white, and she lay there, staring at the haze-choked sky, the dunes silent around her. The rasp was gone. The husks still below, but the sand shimmered, wet and sticky, a faint ripple spreading outward. She rolled onto her side, coughing, a dry, hacking sound that spat salt onto the ground, and pushed herself up, her arms trembling, half her body a cracked white shell. The Amsel was a distant speck, the beach her only chance, and she crawled, dragging her legs, the sand sucking at her like a lover she'd betrayed. The dunes gave way to the shore, a gray expanse littered with fish husks, their crystallized eyes glinting in the dawn. Lena's knees sank into the damp mess, her hands clawing forward, salt flaking from her skin in chunks. The tide was out, the waves a dull crash, but the sand was wetter here, leaving white streaks on her palms, her chest, her face. Her eyes cleared, the white haze lifting, but they stung, gritty with a residue she couldn't blink away. The Amsel loomed ahead, its hull cracked and tilted, a ghost of her old life, but it was gone, swallowed by the sand, the sea, the thing beneath. She stopped, kneeling, her breath a sob, and saw it. The ocean turning white, salt spreading across the waves, a slow, endless tide. She staggered upright, her legs buckling, and limped toward the road beyond the beach, a faint track she'd glimpsed days ago. Her body broke with each step, salt cracking her elbows, her knees, her skin flaking into the wind, and her chest tightened, a weight inside her, shifting, waiting. A truck rumbled in the distance, its headlights cutting through the haze, and she waved, her arm heavy, salt falling from her sleeve. It stopped, a grizzled driver peering out, his face creasing with shock at her bloodied, salt-crusted form. "Help," she croaked, her voice dry, barely human, and he pulled her in, the cab warm against her cold, brittle skin. She said nothing, mute and hollow, as the truck rolled south, the dunes fading behind her. Her hands rested in her lap, stained with ash that wouldn't wash off, salt, black ooze, something older, and she stared out the window, the ocean a white smear on the horizon. The driver muttered questions, but she didn't hear, didn't answer. The rasp was gone, the husk silent, but she felt it still. Inside her, a hunger that stirred. A piece of the entity she'd carried out. Her wrist was cold, the burn a faint scar, but her chest ached, a dry, grainy weight that pulsed faintly, waiting. The truck's radio crackled, static hissing, and her name whispered through it. "Lena!" Soft, cracked, a voice from the pit. She flinched, her hands clenching, salt flaking onto the seat, and the driver glanced over, frowning. "You all right?" he asked, but she didn't reply, her eyes fixed on the whitening sea. The memory of her mother's hands flickered, then died, leaving her empty, a husk holding something alive. She'd stopped it, wounded it, but it wasn't dead. It was free, and she was its shore, its vessel, its bridge to the world. The truck rumbled on, the coast shrinking in the mirror, and Lena sat, half blind, half salt, her breath a dry rasp that matched the waves. The sand had let her go, but it hadn't released her, not really. It waited inside her, and she knew, as the white tide spread, that this was only the beginning.